As I've been developing this course, I've spit out some more final looking images as I develop the model and the materials and the lighting. These are some of them. This is the main one I wanted to concentrate on. And again, when we're coming up with compositions, usually we're doing this for a client and they want to see what the entire room is going to look like. So we can't just do vignettes like these ones that you see here, because that doesn't describe the room to anybody. And a lot of times we're doing this in order to describe the room to a client via imagery. Right? So we're somewhat limited by that. We need to be able to show the whole room. So this is my overall shot. And you can see I just went with a symmetrical composition standing right in the doorway, getting in just enough of these edges to show some foreground. And then going with a pretty high exposure image to kind of blow out this area to show a lot of natural light coming into the room and making it look like just an airy and very light and bright room, because that's the mood I want to go for. And what does your eye concentrate on here? Well, the intention is that it concentrates here because it's very busy here. It's in the center of the image, and kind of everything leads your eye to there. And that is a good thing. It's a dining room, so that's kind of where we want to be focusing. Here, the focus is created by using depth of field, obviously. We're focusing right here on these wine bottles. They have these nice labels, nice materials on them, and things around them are blurred, and that makes it so that we focus right in this area. And this one is using more of a lower exposure with candlelight to kind of warm up this area in here and highlight it, so that's where we focus. You can see in the foreground there's these blurred chair backs, which are much darker and also blurred so that they don't distract from what we're wanting to look at here. This one is more of a high key image, and the focal point is obviously again at the points where it's focused, maybe on this napkin and up here. Okay, so that just creates that effect, a little bit of overexposure going on, except on the parts that we want to focus on, right? So we're looking right towards that window, and so it's kind of blowing out. And yeah, these parts are not really overexposed, maybe in the highlights, but this darker object stands out against that white background. Okay, let's take a look at that main camera that I have set up. And these, of course, are just physical cameras set up here by clicking on camera, putting the camera in, and just using it as default at first. And in the later versions of Max, that will turn on exposure control, physical camera exposure control, which is fine. You just need to know that that's turned on. And what that means is that you can control the exposure now from here with all the other settings. So let's look at these settings. If we look through this camera by selecting it and hitting C, we can see this is our main rendering that I just showed you. If I hit Shift F, it shows safe frames, which shows me the aspect ratio that I'm going to be rendering at. I don't think that's the actual aspect ratio that I spit out the final images at. You change that by going here. And changing, you can unlock this here and change the aspect ratio. Go to 1600 and see what we get there. That actually locked it, sorry. So 2500 by 1600. Actually, let's put this aspect ratio at 1.6. Okay, so that's actually, I think, a better looking composition, perhaps. You might want to see more of the ceiling and more of the floor. So the aspect ratio is actually an important part of the composition as well. So I like this right here, and I think that's what I rendered at, because that shows a little bit of the floor in the foreground, so we're not cutting off the floor straight to that carpet. So it shows that there's parquet floor over here. It also shows the entire chandelier, which I like. So that's a very good aspect ratio for this particular image. And that doesn't mean it's got to be the same aspect ratio for every camera in your image. Other cameras will work better with other aspect ratios. You could render them all at this size and then crop them if you wanted afterwards. But aspect ratio is an important part of our overall composition. So keep that in mind. So let's stay at this aspect ratio and look at our cameras. We can select the camera here by right-clicking, hitting select camera. Now the settings in here. The focal length is at 29, which is still pretty wide angle actually. You don't want to go much wider than that. If you're down in the 20 range, then you can see how skewed this looks. This looks really far away. This circle up here is very, very elliptical and skewed. You're seeing a ton of ceiling, a ton of floor. That's just not a good zoom angle for an interior photograph. I would say that you don't want to go much lower than 26, and it's probably even better to remain around the 30 millimeter range. unless you want to get some serious skewing going on. That shouldn't be a hard and fast rule because different situations might call for different things, but in general, if you don't want a lot of distortion going on, want to be in the 30 range, right around there. Okay, now that is going to be one of our settings. We can go to here, and in the same area we have the focal length, and then we also have the aperture. And remember, the aperture, the low number opens up the aperture nice and wide. We saw on the diagram that it was 1.4 was a low one. So 2 is pretty low. And what that does is it lets in a lot of light, but it also creates a short area of focus for our camera. So let's see what that does. It also affects our exposure by letting a lot of light in. So the aperture is set to the focus is right here. It can be custom, and you can set the focus to different areas. And now you can see that line there and that line there are the edges of the focus. This line here is the center of the focus. So basically right here is going to be very crisp. As it gets to the edges, it's going to start blurring. Starting right there, things are going to be out of focus. Okay, so that's what that's showing you. Now, if you change the aperture to something bigger, which actually means that the aperture is closing down really small and focusing better, then you get a larger area that can be in focus. Okay, that also changes your exposure. It changes it down because less light will be getting in. Think of it like your eye. If your eye pupil needs to focus, it shrinks down really small, doesn't let in a ton of light from all angles. It focuses and gets small. That's what the aperture is doing. And if the aperture is open nice and wide, it is letting in a lot of light, but it has a harder time focusing. Okay, so at 2, it has this short amount of focus, but that's okay because we are wanting to focus mostly. You can see where the focus is. It goes right past the back of those chairs, which will be slightly out of focus, and then the whole table is in focus. Okay, so that's perfect. And so you'd have to also enable depth of field for that to work. Now, to be physically accurate camera, depth of field would always be on. It's just that it will be much less pronounced depending on how focused your aperture is. We have shutter speed here too, which the duration is at 0.5 seconds. Is that right? Okay, but like I said, and like this little note says here, affects exposure and motion blur. Okay, we're not going to have a lot of motion in this scene. Nothing's going to be moving. So that's not really going to affect anything for us except how bright our overall exposure is. However, we can also just go down here to exposure and set a target. The exposure value currently being used with the camera, either specified manually or derived from the provided ISO value, okay? So you can see that the ISO is the last thing that can affect. We have aperture, we have shutter speed, and we have the ISO, which can also affect our exposure. But what's more simple, because ISO doesn't really change anything in a virtual camera. There's no noise going up and down with it. So it's easier to just disable it and set a target exposure. Okay, so this is just setting a target exposure. 8 is a pretty bright photo. You can go, I think 6 might be default. I don't remember. But 8 makes it brighter for us. And that's the easiest way to get a properly exposed image, to just set a target number for it. And basically that's like the auto mode of your camera. Say, this is the exposure I want. Make sure my ISO adjusts enough so that that's the exact exposure I get. And then really this shutter speed and aperture doesn't matter as much for your exposure anymore because you've got a target exposure set here. So it's really just affecting depth of field and motion blur if you were to have any. Now, white balance is important. You can set it for whatever situation you've got going on. I've just left it up default here, because you can also adjust white balance in the frame buffer, the render frame buffer. So we'll look at that later and we won't worry about it much here. And of course you can always adjust that in Photoshop too. But if you're getting something that's way too cool or way too warm, then you might want to adjust your white balance to accommodate. Now, if I had all these lights in this room, all with the really warm temperature, you can get light bulbs in various different temperatures. If I had it all warm, then I might want to adjust my white balance to accommodate for that. But really I've left them more in the just slightly warm range and haven't put them to the accurate color that they actually would be. You could do that if you wanted. Enable vignetting. Vignetting on a camera is when the edges get dark. Okay, here's an example of extreme vignetting. The super dark corners on a circular lens, and that's obviously very extreme. You've all seen vignetting before though, and here this is not a lot of vignetting, this is a ton of vignetting. Okay, so sometimes that can be a useful trick to make you focus in the center of the image more, but on these interior shots I would say you don't want it unless it's very, very subtle. There might be some very subtle vignetting going on. I would do it in post in Photoshop and not turn it on here, because in Photoshop you have full control to turn it up or down however you want. So I would just leave it off, go ahead and leave it off here. You can adjust it up and down here if you want, from 0.1 to 1 as an example. So 1 would be extreme vignetting. Okay, bokeh is with depth of field. Bokeh, if you don't know what that is, I'll find an example. This is what bokeh effects look like. They create kind of this cool, moody look, which, I mean, look at that photo, it's cool. But what that is where there's a hot spot in your scene, basically a light source, then it will start taking on, if it's blurring out, it will start taking on the shape of your aperture. So I showed you how the aperture kind of opens like a spiral shape, and it has blades on it. So these will take on the shape of that aperture. Okay, so that this camera has an aperture that's that shape right there. Okay, so as it blurs, that's what it'll kind of look like. So here's some real life bokeh effects. And 3ds-Max can actually recreate this, which is awesome. Can make a really cool effect. So see, here is something that is cool. As the light bulb blurs, it starts to get this bokeh looking light bulb, and back there you can really see the bokeh shape. Okay, so that can be affected in 3ds-Max by turning on bokeh effects, and that's just a pure circle right there, and you can also change it to blades 5. You can also put in a custom texture, which can get some really cool effects, because a lot of bokeh effects have kind of weird edges on them, so you could use a custom texture, which would just be a black and white, that would give you some very realistic looking bokeh effects. And even if your lens has like some dirt on it, then your bokeh would start showing that dirt. So you could use like kind of a dirt mask for your bokeh effect. You can do a lot of different things, make custom shapes. I'll bring up an example of a rendering I've done in 3ds-Max with some bokeh effects. Okay, here's a little image I did that shows some great bokeh effects. Specifically here on the lights, you got these tiny little bokehs going on, and you can see they're a little harder on the edges and softer in the middle. That's because I used a custom bokeh mask. Here's some nice bokeh right here. There you can really see it on that little LED light. Harder on the edge and softer in the middle. And here again you see it. Okay, so those are bokeh effects, all created not in Photoshop, but straight out of 3ds-Max, and this is rendered with Vray. But all render engines can create the same effects. Okay, so that's bokeh. The only other thing that's really important is going to be perspective control, which is pretty basic. Most of you probably understand this already. If you turn off vertical control, auto vertical control, I should say, and you can do a tilt shift camera here, which just shifts your image plane up and down, which is pretty cool. That's the lens shift. The tilt is what really importantly needs to be fixed. So if you're looking up a little bit with the camera, it will start tilting like that, and you don't want that. So this mimics a tilt shift lens, which can basically correct for those things. Any distortion that you might have, it can be corrected using the tilt and shift lens. So in architectural photography, they always straighten out the verticals, and Max can do that by just hitting this auto vertical correct, so that line right there is completely vertical, and so is that line right there, and every other vertical line. And like I showed you, the shift can just shift that lens slightly up and down to give you a different image plane, which is cool. We don't really need it for this. That would be more for taking pictures of like a high-rise outside or something. That's when these tilt shift lenses become very important. But even the vertical correction is important for an interior shot like this. Now the last thing is miscellaneous clipping planes. Okay, so clipping plane, if it's enabled, then it can clip out whatever's in front of you. So let's say this camera here was outside of the room. We'd be looking into the back of a wall. But if we turn on clipping planes, then we can look through that wall. Let me just show you quickly. Enable. Start turning it up, and you will see the red line coming out of the camera, which is your front clipping plane, your near clipping plane. Your far clipping plane is 3,200 feet out there, so it's plenty of feet away. But now that's inside that wall, so we should be able to look through it, just like that. So that's how you can get the much larger zoom angles. See, the focal length is 99 here. We could go even more and be outside the room and get some really interesting effects without any warping because we've got this super tight zoom angle. Okay, so that's one of the advantages of a virtual camera, and you can see the depth of field is kind of happening in my scene right now, which is cool. It'd be focused back there. I don't know how accurate that is. I'd have to check it with the actual target distance, but that gives you a little preview of the effect, which is cool. So back to this camera. We've basically got everything set up. I've gone over all the basic settings of the camera and how to use it in 3ds-Max to create artistic effects and also just improve our compositions and improve overall effect of our image by allowing our eyes to focus in the right place. So hopefully that gives you a great breakdown of all the camera settings.